All right, so welcome. We're gonna do like a quick, well, probably not quick, but a bit of an overview of this project that we've been working on and building up to with the channel. And yeah, the first release from us being Ganky Admission. So thought we would use the channel as a place to maybe go through some process stuff and just give you an idea as to what this is all about. I can't really give you an idea as to where to buy this thing at this point, but I can definitely show you what we've been working on.
Well, knowing you and I, this is going to become a deep dive, whether we mean to or not.
Yeah,
Introduce yourself, Gord.
Yeah, so I'm Gord Cummings. I'm the guy who came up with the Ganky and whose voice you've been hearing in those haul videos. So over the past, I would say 7 months, 8 months, just been working really hard on some art and telling a bigger story from the bigger story, kind of taking a few pieces from that and publishing them independently. Partly to maybe court some publisher for the bigger work, but really just to say some things that I think are important, or raise topics that I think are important that people aren't necessarily talking about. Maybe giving tribute to some folks whose voice really deserves to be highlighted, and some issues that I think need to be highlighted that perhaps are not being discussed enough, or at least talking about those things from my perspective. So yeah, that was way too much. But I think you're right. We're gonna have no problem getting into the nitty-gritty.
I know how we do it.
This.
And so this is the hand of Charles. You've seen the hand of Gord in all of this.
Hello.
So I'm the second guy on the cover here, and I'm just really lucky to know Gord and have him kind of introduce me back into this kind of creative endeavor of stuff, and I'm helping out with the I kind of do the book design, did the cover of the first one, because I'm a graphic designer by trade, and yeah, I'll be doing my own issue of this in the future here. Mm-hmm. Gord is the guy who does the biggest output, but I'm going to try to do my own issue as well, and yeah, really thankful to be a part of the whole Ganky idea, and loving it so far.
And I guess too, as Ganky sort of takes shape, the deeper we get into it, like the second issue is pretty much already done. Just waiting for a cover, and we're putting the book. Charles is putting the book together, not so much me, but like the writing's done, the art's done for the second issue, and then Charles has a script. He's been doing some work for another issue of Ganky. And as this thing grows, that's kind of something I want to see happen with it, is maybe people taking an interest in maybe wanting to do an issue of their own of Ganky. I'm so open to that. Really, really would love to see it become that. Just a place for people to put stories that they want to tell, that have that kind of, it's got a social issue piece to it, definitely Canadian. That's really it. Like, that's the only unifying theme. Even the format, I expect, is going to change, right? Depending on the artist, depending on who does it. And I'm very open to any of that. So yeah, I guess that's a good spot to jump in.
Yeah, I think
this thing. All right. So yeah, you're looking at the cover. This is the second run of the Ganky Admission, the first issue. We did a run in preparation for Comic Book Christmas in July by the cartoonist Kayfabe crew, and we dropped about, I would say, 40 copies of this thing.
Yeah, roughly.
Out in the wild at different little libraries, which was so good, so awesome. Just all around Calgary. I might take a few copies out with me as we travel to like Medicine Hat area this week, and drop some out there of this one. But the size changed from the first run to this run, in that the size of the first run was like more like a cell phone, like just cell phone size. I don't even have any copies of that.
Yeah, the first one was roughly the size, was more of this kind of size here, and then the sort of original, sort of intended size has actually changed a bit actually during the process. So as I was building the book, initially when we weren't sure whether we'd be printing it commercially or printing it ourselves, it's become this more bespoke, like printing ourselves and binding ourselves and all that sort of thing. And Gord's been doing really the lead on that, and his family as well, pitching it. While I was, at the time we were doing that first smaller run, that was that cell phone size, basically like, I think it ended up being about a 6.5 by 3 or so.
Yeah.
About 6 by 3. I was recovering from COVID at that time, so they were doing all of that themselves. while the guy who's used to production and finishing was laying down quite a bit. But the original intended size, when we were looking at maybe doing this commercially for the printing, was even larger than this. And then was brought down to this roughly, it's like an 8 by 4. It's always been this sort of like a ratio of 2 by 1. But originally it was a little bit bigger until I realized we wouldn't be able to print that ourselves on the machine that Gord has. So we did this really nice 8 by 4, and it's worked out so well, and there was very minimal changes, but it also worked at this smaller size. It's chopped there, but it also worked here, and it worked so great for those initial drops because we both sort of for the comic Christmas in July bundled them with other comics to put in there.
There's a lot of Marvel number ones in these little.
So almost
libraries.
to be it's like our carrier as we let Ganky proliferate like a virus. We kept it on a carrier of maybe a more mainstream comic.
Totally.
And it worked out so well because it's a nice it's the protein clinging onto the what's the nobody wants to hear about that kind of stuff. Anyways, but it works so well. But
the barnacles of culture.
It's worked at every size, and in the design, as a designer. We really had to make some decisions as we went through it of how we're going to make sure that it's readable at these different sizes, and what's our intended size. And this is sort of in the end what our intended size is. This way you're probably going to see it from here on out. When we do these some Comic Con appearances and things like that.
Which we do have a couple.
Yes.
We do have a couple. I should mention, you folks in Edmonton, we're very likely going to see you. I haven't heard back from the convention organizers yet. But panel 1 in October will be there for sure for that
here in
show.
Calgary.
Yeah, here in Calgary. And
this is what you'll see, and this is what you'll be getting. And so this is really intended. It's a little bigger, so think of it almost as a little bit of a premium for you. This was kind of the size we did for the kind of giveaways, to spread it out there. And this is what you'll be getting, is this a little bit larger and kind of the intended finished look.
Totally. Okay, so without further ado, let's just dive in. Whoa, that's a terrible copy to show. It's misprinted. Here we go.
Hey, bespoke thing. When we talk about this bespoke nature of like a hand, we kind of do things guerrilla style, where we're really doing it ourselves. You get some fun stuff.
Oh yeah, this one's thicker too. I better go through those and do some QC. All right, so first open the inner. I don't know, what do you call this spread? The first spread.
Yeah,
we
were lucky in that when you're making a booklet, you've gotten certain sizes. There's like steps that as you go larger in size, that you're kind of beholden to. So it gave us a chance to kind of showcase more of your sketches and some fun stuff that goes along with it. So this first spread is really like it's like chaotic, right?
Totally,
and that's what I love about it.
There's a few things I wanted to do. So this drawing on the left, it's just an old drawing of a broken cell phone screen. I really do think that those are beautiful things. Just like the randomness in how phone screens break.
It's like a fractal.
It's totally like a fractal. And I was like, when I look at that, like, I just want to, it draws me in. I think cool drawings do that as well. Like they do draw you in, and they want you to, it's almost asking you to touch it. Like, it's very texture based. I find that with broken cell phone screens so much. I just want to stare at them.
And I love sacred geometry and symmetry, but this shows how pure chaos is just as intricate, just as beautiful, and has it has its own laws and its own its own form that it takes, almost in that same way, even though it's pure chaos.
It's pure chaos, absolute beauty,
and that's
trying to capture it. Yeah,
and that's kind of Ganky, right?
it's totally.
It's
Ganky.
about, we look when we talk about, because we deal so much in like Canadian identity and immigration and stuff like that. Like, there's a very, when you look at Canada, it's a very sort of ordered idea in the way that we think about it, but in reality, it's this. In reality, it's chaos.
I think so.
It's chaos that seems to have some sort of order to it, just like the universe has.
Yeah,
and that's what makes it interesting. Anyways,
totally.
We're getting stuck on the first page.
And
we like to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And this page, same kind of idea. This was a drawing of SpongeBob SquarePants. There's a lot to this drawing that's going on. But I am a fan of Chip Kid. I think his stuff looks awesome. In some cases, there's more Chip Kid than the original stuff, but some of that stuff is cool. Like seeing the strokes that some of these classic artists have made when they were creating their work is just like the neatest
Looking
stuff,
at detail work of comic art is some of the most interesting stuff you can do. So imagine if this were the entire picture. This is a piece about that large.
Yeah.
This is that's how close of a detail we're getting. Then that's where you see the real beauty of your lines. You always say your Ganky lines. That's kind of
my Ganky lines.
Partly where that's
It's
come from.
totally
It's but you can see the beauty in that and of those actual strokes.
and kind of gross too. Like I think if we're to enjoy that beauty, we need to be somewhat comfortable with the disgusting aspects of it.
It's putting pond slime under a microscope and
Totally.
then seeing intricacy and beauty in that disgusting kind of detail.
Yeah, there is. So, okay, I should give some background, like the way that this comes about in the overall work. So this is a small kind of documentary kind of scene, giving the reader some explanation as to what's going on in the story. So the bigger story, it's an experience that I was part of growing up, where a good friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, I would say he was my best friend. We grew up side by side. He went missing. But there are political aspects to his going missing that make the story more important, or more something that really is a result of the bigger social circumstances. So one of those is Canada's refugee policies and immigration policies in the 1980s and 1990s, and then discovering how some of that stuff has changed since that time. That's what this Ganky admission is. But giving the reader kind of an explanation as to how this El Salvadorian kid finds his way to Canada, this really, really small town in the 1990s. There is an explanation for that. When we think of rural Albertan towns, usually you think like a lot of white people, and it is. But in the 1990s, that started to change. And I think the reader needs an explanation as to why that happens. And that's really what this Ganky admission is taking some of that, and taking some of that art, taking that narrative, and then adding a few pieces to it to really make a strong statement about the current state of immigration in Canada. So the second issue is very similar, but it's about Canada's reserve system. And in the overall narrative, there's a piece about a kid who is experiencing sort of the consequences of that intergenerational trauma, Canada's aggressive assimilation policies to Indigenous people in Canada. So giving that background, because not everybody knows about that either, right? It's something that I think is on people's radars now, but there's still a lot of pieces that people are not aware of.
Yeah, it's amazing, even though it's on people's lips at this point, how much of it is still unspoken and still not really delved into in sort of a wide encompassing way.
Totally. And how does that impact us? How do we perceive Canada as these kids who were growing up in the 90s in rural Canada? How does our story fit in that story? Because we are the children of settlers or the children of colonizers. So, like the grandchildren or great grandchildren in many cases of these colonizing forces, how do we craft our own identity within these really significant events? Immigration is part of that discussion, right? So with that being said, here is the first page of that explanation as to how Canada's foreign policy has been, and currently is. So, the history of Canada doesn't all exist within Canada. It exists in the foreign policy of United States, which we have to acknowledge, and that's kind of what a lot of the drawings are in this issue of Ganky.
Yeah, because you can't talk about anything basically foreign policy or political in the 1980s or 90s without talking about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Because that shaped so much of the world, especially when you look at South America as well. They were so heavily involved in everything to do with South American politics and South American politicians and events leading up to refugee immigration. As a result of those policies, and this right here, this page here, puts that into such stark focus for me. Like that, the story is one born of violence. It's one born of suffering and human tragedy, and that's always been the story of these sort of like foreign policy decisions that have been made. It's always been to either create violence or as a reaction to violence.
Like forcefully taking people, right? Like how can you convince people to work when they're not seeing the spoils of that work, when they're not seeing the positives for that work? Like I think in our modern context, we know that, when you go to work, generally it's for making somebody else wealthy. We know that's the case, but at the same time, we get reimbursed for that, we get paid for that. But in El Salvador at this time, it was like you got some farmers, they're farming different crops. They don't have any rights to any of that. They don't get to eat any of that. And yet you have to motivate these people to still produce. How do you do that? You pull out a big gun and you convince people to do that. And that's essentially what the American government was doing. They were installing governments in South America that really just carried guns and used those guns on their citizens. So some of the characters in my bigger story, this graphic novel that I've got, that's how they came to Canada. It was totally like chased out of their country. And it's because they were farmers. They were farmers who couldn't eat. They were not allowed to eat the things that they were farming. And when people disagreed with that, man, like firing squads, people going missing, homes just being taken over by the El Salvadoran government, which was a puppet government, very much a puppet government. It gets into some of that in here with my representation of my poor representation of Ronald Reagan, who's going to show up in a number of different Ganky productions.
You're going to have a lot of practice.
Yeah,
on
Reagan.
Reagan.
He's at the core of a lot of what's going on. And I should mention, like, if you're from outside of Canada and you're watching this video, like Canadian policy overall is influenced by a lot of things to do with the United States, and our image of ourselves as like a humanitarian nation was transformed. As I got to be friends with this kid from El Salvador, largely because like Canada was as this one lawyer says. There's this great quote in here by Jeffrey House. Canada feels it is its responsibility to soothe the hard edges of American policy. So he's talking about American foreign policy. He was lawyer who helped out with the kids coming in from Vietnam, or the families coming in from Vietnam. So this drawing is that. This is the boat people that came about in the 1980s to Canada. Jeffrey House helped those people come into Canada. He was their lawyer. They just showed up. And yeah, he's right. He's totally right. Like, the United States being that manifest destiny, all that stuff. We're going to conquer. We're going to control your crops. We're going to reap the benefits of anything that you produce in these two continents of Central and South America.
Yeah, I've often looked at it as if you can imagine for a moment, anytime you see you see a large truck pulling a smaller vehicle with a rope, or a large boat and a smaller boat behind it, even if you're pulling you're on a ATV and you're pulling somebody on a sled behind you, the one follows the other. But if you look back at those tracks, they're never on the same path exactly. It's always an action and reaction. And that's how I've always looked at Canada. So that's why this quote is so amazing, because he doesn't just say that we follow there. We're there to soften those hard edges. So meaning that we're deviating from that path a little bit and just trying to make it a little, we're always an action and reaction. We're never just mirroring what they do. We mirror. In Canada, we often like to say that we just mirror what happens in the States 6 months later, or 2 years later, or 5 years later, but that's not really the case.
Yeah,
we're behind there because we're influenced by it. We're in especially if you think about it as two boats, we're also going over the wake that's behind that boat, and that sends us over here, it sends us over there, but that's
right.
And in some cases, unfortunately, we are trying to almost like mitigate damage.
I think so.
In some cases, or be a safe haven, or be an alternative, or be something complementary that is just a little different. And that's the that's that weird nuance that we sometimes fall into as Canada and Canadians. And then of course we have our own host of pros and cons to everything we do in every part of our society. And
well, I think it goes to a lot of those stereotypes that exist about Canadians, right? Like us being really kind, really polite, which, I think reinforces a lot of the perception that I had, or at least that I was fed, that Canada is a humanitarian nation. Mm-hmm. And then all the stuff that was coming out during like the Rwandan genocide, and our man Romeo Dallaire over there,
or our problems we had with the Somali peacekeeping tour, where we had one of our soldiers torture a young Somali man,
right,
where that really, for me, I remember that being a pivotal moment, because that's where I had always thought of Canada as a peacekeeping nation.
Right,
that's what we did.
Right.
We were humanitarians. That's what we did, and I saw that and said, oh wait, it's not purely that.
Yeah.
We've got our own hard edges as well.
Totally.
And I remember that being pretty transformative for me, because I always, in that era, we were always wearing the white or blue hats of the UN peacekeeping forces,
right.
And then that almost in its own way kind of whitewashed what we are capable of as people.
Right.
And then things like Rwanda, and our failures there, and things like the Somali torture incident kind of brought that back into stark focus and reminded you that what sometimes your best intentions, even you're not really there. It's
totally. I think your metaphor is so bang on, and it kind of makes me a little scared, because I love to canoe. Canada's the little canoe behind this speedboat.
Yeah.
And we are little in comparison. We're so small. Like, even though we've got all this land here, like our population is minuscule compared to the United States. that has some consequences, and maybe it's because of that we kind of go along with a lot. But I think a lot of the reasons why we go along with a lot has a lot to do, again, with our man Ronald Reagan. My poor representation of Ronald Reagan, right? Like, he's free trade really had some consequences for Canada, and I think free trade is, and the consequences of free trade is what has maybe led us out of that place of being a humanitarian force for the world. You know, George Bush did a good job of discrediting the UN, and maybe as a result has discredited this identity that is Canada in the process. We're not.
We kind of had to.
We can't fool ourselves any longer.
Kind of have to find ourselves again and find the identity, because it's a constant moving point of light you're trying to find.
And the experiences that I've had in working in immigration, like for a long time I was working in management at a settlement organization. So these settlement organizations, there's quite a variety out there. You've got the government sponsored ones, or the government funded ones that it's nonprofits that are doing that, and then you've got the organizations or businesses out there that are actually like helping people with settlement, that do the exact same work, but one's more like from a social work perspective, one's more from a profit perspective. So I worked in the social work end of things and saw, hey, you know what, things have changed a lot since I was that kid growing up in small town Alberta, where I had neighbors that were Vietnamese, or I had neighbors that, El Salvadoran, Mexican, whoever, coming to Canada, seeing Canada as a refuge, and then that all changes. And that's largely what the essay portion of this work is about. So as you start to move into this here, now I'm starting to talk about some of that history of Canadian immigration and how much it changed under the Conservative government in like the mid 2000s, I would say. Around that time that this fucking guy, Stephen Harper, is making apologies to our Indigenous people here in Canada. In the next issue, I talk about that too, where it's like this guy and his buddies, we have another fellow who's a really important part of this story and an important part of our current story in our province, is Jason Kenney. So Jason Kenney was the Minister of Immigration and Labor in the mid-2000s.
And it's amazing because, currently, as of this recording, not for too much longer, he's still the Premier of Alberta, but with their time in federal politics, shaped a lot of the things that we across Canada, but particularly in the West, are dealing with right now. It's in terms of the immigration policy, as well as the temporary foreign worker program.
Yeah.
It's undergoing changes right now that are being discussed and being argued for and against, and we're seeing effects of it. So you look at that weird that through line as you draw two lines between points, and there's so much, once again, with the boat analogy, the wake that the decisions that were made federally are still being felt as it trickles out to all the provinces.
Crazy train, man. Totally crazy train. I love that metaphor. It's so good. It's like, yeah, that's kind of how history works, right? Like, it's the interaction of all those different wakes on
it's
the lake.
It's the ripples from each decision that are made. They're felt for much longer than they're intended to be long term, but the way in which those waves undulate, you sometimes are hit at the bottom of that and then crested over with another wave, and you are drowned.
Totally.
So that's the scary part.
And we can talk about that, because I do talk about that in this essay, where like the temporary foreign worker program, right? This is a very problematic part of Canada's history, and it's something that only ended in like 2020 or 2021. The Trudeau government stopped it. But this was Kenney's response when he changed immigration laws in around 2006, where he basically stripped Canada as being a destination for like humanitarian migration, where it's like if you're somebody who's poor, if you're somebody who's going to be mistreated in your country, Canada is a good place for you to come to. And I think that that's a good thing. I think we've got lots of space here. We got tons of space, and we're a very wealthy nation. So to me, the right thing to do is to attract people who maybe aren't treated so well in other parts of the world to come to Canada. But Kenny changed all that with his education requirements and income requirements. Because the argument around that time, and I don't think it's any consequence or any coincidence that Fox News was becoming huge at around that time in Canada, paranoia about immigration, lots of xenophobia going on, and Kenny coming in saying, oh, don't worry, Canada, we'll fix that for you. We're going to get hard on immigration, and we're going to make immigration more efficient. So now you have to be somewhat wealthy to come to Canada to prove to the Canadian government that you're not going to be dependent on them. And you have to be highly educated, because the idea is we're going to attract the best and brightest from across the world to come to Canada. I think it's also worth mentioning that education and income are two things very closely tied to each other. Like, people in different parts of the world are going to have access to education based on their income. So no longer are we attracting people who maybe are mistreated, from poor socioeconomic statuses. We're not reaching out to those kids that come from those families that have potential. Instead, we're reaching out to people who are wealthy to begin with and educated to begin with. Now, I don't want to say that I don't want to say that there's everybody's experience in coming to Canada is going to look a little bit different. Some people have to scrape and save in order to come here, and awesome for those folks that do that. And I talk about this in here as well, where you've got some folks who come from different parts of the world that don't really need to migrate, but are just kind of doing so because Canada is a cool place to go to.
Yeah, and it has its own sets of opportunities that might be different than what you see somewhere else. Standard of living that might be different. Geographically,
it's an attractive
we're
place to come.
very attractive in that way. Yeah,
it's a beautiful country.
Yeah.
We have a very beautiful country, and there's lots of room for you here. But getting in here is hard, and those messages that we were given growing up about Canada being humanitarian, I just don't see that anymore. In fact, it's quite exploitative. So this is going back to Mr. Kenny's policies when he changed everything, and he essentially barred poor people from migrating to Canada at that time. So his humanitarian response was to create basically a modern form of slavery with the live-in caregiver program. Somebody can come to Canada as a caregiver without the education requirements, without the monetary requirements. They can come here, look after somebody else's kids, look after somebody else's loved one, and kind of be almost sponsored in a way. This is where things get really bad.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can almost, like a lot of decisions made, and especially policy, when we're talking about legislative policy, it sometimes will come from a place where you can see the right way of thinking there, the right, maybe the best intentions. You
can almost take this as like good intentions.
Yeah, best intentions, but so easily exploited. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. Without that same care and attention put into the legislation to make sure that it couldn't be exploitable from the get-go in some of the worst ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Horrendous stuff.
Once again, the wake of it.
The wake is abuse and alienation. So those individuals who are motivated to take advantage of Canada's live-in caregiver program are coming from situations that are not good. They're living in a state of poverty, living in a state of uncertainty. And then, okay, well, Canada has this program. I'll go take care of somebody else's children for a while And then once I'm done my time doing that, I can then sponsor the rest of my family to come to Canada. Once I get my permanent resident status or citizenship even, I can then bring the rest of my family to Canada. Unfortunately, for some folks, that process would take anywhere from like 3 years to, I've heard stories of like 18 years where people are just like on the other side of the world in Canada, paid not very well. So they're not going back to the Philippines or they're not going back to Iran to see their family. Some of these folks, a lot of these women that came to Canada in the Living Caregiver program had children of their own. And those children are being raised by somebody else back home. You don't know your kids, and then you're bringing those kids after 5 years of being alienated from them. You didn't engage in the first 5 years parenting with that child. And now you're going to suddenly parent that kid in this country. And
they could have the impression that you are uprooting them from everything they know.
That's what it is.
Because for some of those kids, depending if they were like basically estranged.
Yeah, they were estranged. Fully.
Not by anything malicious on either side.
No.
But in that way, they in some cases did they see Canada then? Were they informed enough to know that like that was a goal that they were going towards, or one day is it just, by the way, we're not going to be here anymore, we're going to another place, and so forget
it's more
everything.
like that.
And then what kind of generational trauma can that create? Because then because we're talking across, when we even talk about your immediate family, you're talking about 2 generations built in there. And that's all it takes to create some sort of divide, and then the ripples from that can then happen in the next generation and the next generation of how of informing our children and caring for them and being a part of their lives, and what the consequences that our actions make in their lives. Totally,
Absolutely. And now it's something that people are starting to pay attention to. It's this reunification is largely what it's called. And it's something that has to be targeted to those moms who came to Canada by way of the Living Caregiver program. I didn't even mention the conditions that some of these women had to work in some of the homes that they were in, right? So like bad stuff happened, as you can expect, where there's like no accountability. This woman's here, she's just trying to make the best life that she can. If she speaks up about any abuses that are happening to her in wealthy Canadian homes, she fears deportation. She fears all kinds of bad stuff is going to happen to her.
Because in so many cases, that's the only eventual consequence.
Yeah, that's the only thing.
It can be only negative for the person making the making that report.
Yeah, and how long are you going to be in this situation? For some families, it's going to be 3 years, which is fine. Well, I don't think it's fine. I think it's still exploitation. But if you have somebody who's sending money back home, maybe going back home once every 3 or 4 years, saving up to go back home every 3 or 4 years to the other side of the world, it's like your chances of liberation just are destroyed. And the only conclusion I can draw from all this is that it's poverty exploitation, and Kenny is like all over it. And I like to say that this all ended, but as you said, this shit's still unfolding now. This stuff's still going on now. So just to bring you up to speed, like I think probably not even a month ago this went down, where in Alberta a lot of employers are saying that people don't want to work, or there's not enough workers,
or they're not applying for certain jobs that are less palatable to quote unquote Canadians.
Yeah, jobs that people don't necessarily want, or perhaps the working conditions are so bad in some of these jobs that Canadians are like, I'm not putting up with that shit. I'm not going to go do that anymore. Canada's oil and gas industry is particularly problematic in this.
And especially things like our meat packing.
Meat packing is really bad.
That's one that's been actually fueling the changes that's been happening, are quite often our food production.
Food production, yeah, like natural resource exploitation as well. It's like instead of employing Canadians, now Kenny's gone to the federal government to say, hey, there's not enough workers out here. We need to open up our temporary foreign worker program even more. So now you're going to get a lot of people coming in who are trying to escape poverty in their country, coming into Canada and being exploited, working in conditions that are not good.
And often finding that they're going from poverty in one case to poverty.
Yeah.
You're going from poverty in a developing nation to poverty in a developed nation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And suddenly finding that they're in that whole situation that we always call the working poor.
Yeah.
Where you have a job, but it does not even pay for your standard of living. It does not allow you to have, say, your own place to live. You may be bunked with a half dozen of your coworkers who are all in the same situation. We're finding that we're finding more and more reports of that. And yeah, you're simply just moving from poverty here to poverty there.
And the conditions are so bad. The conditions are really bad.
And it can be very dangerous work with high levels of stress, repetitive stress injuries, traumatic injuries, and exploitation by the employer.
Yeah, we saw it when COVID-19 first hit Alberta.
Yeah.
Where were the outbreaks happening? Meat packing plants.
Always at food production.
Meat packing, 100%. All right, so I get obviously very passionate about this topic. Everybody's involved in it. It's not just something that's like
and it's
tied to
every political stripe.
Yeah, every political stripe in Canada. I mean, Trudeau is part of it as well. We can't say it's any one person. So, okay, just to finish off this overview, I want to talk about Peter Singer a little bit. So, Peter Singer, he's a living philosopher. He's pretty famous dude at this point. I would say mostly in circles concerning like eating animals. He writes a lot about being vegan and things like that. But he also has this concept about like how do we devise our ethics based on distance, right? So for a lot of us who participate in this consumerist North American identity, we sort of shut down knowledge about production, of where things are made, how it's made.
No one wants to know how the
Nobody
sausage is
wants
made.
to know how the sausage is made. But Peter Singer is saying, hey, you have a responsibility to those people who are dying as a result of you wearing that shirt that you bought from. I guess I shouldn't say maybe we will get censored by YouTube. Is that something we need to worry about?
We'll do an issue on it. You can probably do an entire series on clothing production.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even then barely scratch the surface.
Yeah, we have a responsibility to our global neighbors, is basically what Peter Singer says. Yeah. And as a kid who grew up in a culture where it's like, hey, we're humanitarian, we have something to offer, I think we need to be talking about this kind of poverty exploitation. Even though Canada might not be doing it, by the way, they are doing it locally.
That was facetious.
Even if your perception is that it's not happening here, all Canadians are living just fine, know that our state of comfort is as a result of poverty that exists in other parts of the world.
It always comes off the back of something else, or someone else in most cases.
Absolutely. It's part of the capitalist engine, right? So, okay, last thing I'll say before we move on to maybe some production stuff. This picture, just like a self-portrait of me. You can't
I love
see
it.
me now.
You know what it reminds me of? And don't take this badly. There's the Cyclops in the movie Krull. If you've ever seen Krull,
Yeah.
it reminds me
It's
so much
totally
of that.
got the
It's so great. But then you're also a Titan, like an old school Titan, where you are 10,000 stories tall, and you've got a civilization on your back. I love this thing so much.
Nice.
There's so much mythology. I also love mythology, and there's so much mythology.
Nice, thanks, man.
So it's really cool.
Yeah, it's all part of bigger stuff and experiences that I've had over the past year. Crazy stuff. Yeah, I'll go here. It's I went through ketamine assisted psychotherapy for some severe depression. And coming out of the ketamine treatments, I became so productive creatively. And that's largely what you're seeing here. For some reason, when I was in the medicine, this image that I had drawn years ago kept popping up, and I couldn't escape this imagery. So I redrew it, and this is it. The hands, the headpiece, the stuff on my back, all of it has meaning in terms of my experiences within the medicine. Even the title, Ganky, for some reason, when I was in the medicine and coming out of the medicine, I just kept saying this word over and over and over and over and over. Ganky, Ganky, Ganky. What does that mean? What does that mean? And now it's the title of our creative endeavor.
Yeah. Great. and it's fun to say.
It's punchy. It's totally punchy.
It's almost got its own onomatopoeia where, you know, back in the, you know, thinking of comics over the years of big booms and vrooms, Ganky has its own, I don't know what's being hit or what's happening, but it's got its own motion and feeling and sound to it.
Totally. Its root word, gank, comes from, I think, Trailer Park Boys. I watch a lot of Trailer Park Boys, and they use the word gank a lot. And it's in reference to stealing, right? Like you gank this from the meat department at the grocery store, which in art is something that we always talk about, especially in comics. Like you're constantly ganking from somewhere else. You're building on the shoulders of giants. That
all art is theft,
right? All art is theft. We're being ganky, and I think in that, like, what is ours? What's not ours? I'm going to talk about that in future projects, like copyright law and how that plays into things.
Yep.
But yeah,
another thing that has been evolving over time.
Yeah, absolutely, and it needs to evolve more.
It's been evolving in ways that only are for the economic benefit of a few small entities.
Oh, absolutely.
Who own a lot of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, how many issues are you gonna do on that one? You could do several.
You could do a whole documentary about it. Totally. So yeah, that's Ganky admission, man.
Yeah.
Yeah.